It started as nothing more than a murmur on the radio, a distant weather report warning of an impending storm. For the residents of White Hollow, a sleepy coastal town in the southern U.S., hurricanes were a familiar threat. They had weathered them before, watched the clouds gather and the winds whip the sea into fury. But there was something different about this storm, something that clung to the air, whispering on the edge of consciousness. Cora Sanders had lived in White Hollow her entire life. She knew the sea, the salt, the way the wind tasted before a storm. But when the local meteorologist announced that Hurricane Isolde was forming, a chill ran down her spine. Isolde was not moving like a normal storm. It was circling, its eye locked on White Hollow, spinning in place as though it was waiting for something. The town prepared as it always did, boarding windows, gathering supplies, securing boats. But every time Cora stepped outside, she felt the storm watching her. The air felt too still, the wind too quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. The first night was tense. The storm raged in the distance, never quite reaching them, but always on the horizon. Cora sat by her window, staring out at the rolling clouds. Her father, Jack, a man of few words but deep wisdom, sat in his armchair, smoking a pipe. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, breaking the silence. Cora nodded, unable to put the unease into words. Jack had spent his life working on the sea, and he believed in the old superstitions of sailors. He spoke of storms that had minds of their own, of waters that carried curses. Cora used to laugh at such tales, but now they didn't seem so far-fetched. The second night, the storm's fury intensified. The winds howled, but Isolde still didn't move closer. It remained on the horizon, spinning, a living entity trapped in a maddening loop. The town was trapped in an eerie calm, the eye of silence. Cora couldn't sleep. The wind carried sounds that didn't belong, the creak of a boat mast, the distant cry of something not quite human. She got out of bed and went downstairs to find her father. Jack was gone, his pipe cold on the armrest. Panic surged through her, but before she could call out, a soft knock came from the front door. She opened it to find her father standing in the yard, his eyes wide, face pale. "Cora, something's out there." She followed him outside, where the wind was stronger than it had been all day. It whipped through the trees, sending leaves scattering across the ground. Jack pointed to the sea, where a strange glow was coming from the horizon, faint but growing. It looked like lights, lanterns on an invisible ship. "They're waiting for us," Jack whispered. "Who?" Cora asked, fear crawling up her spine. "The lost ones," he said. "The souls claimed by the sea." Before she could ask more, a sharp gust of wind whipped past them, carrying with it a voice, a faint, desperate whisper. Cora's blood ran cold. She recognized the voice. It was her mother's. Her mother, who had been lost at sea 5 years ago. "Do you hear that?" Jack asked, his eyes wild. Cora nodded. The whispers grew louder, rising and falling with the wind. They came from all around, as though the storm itself was calling to them. "We need to leave," Cora said, grabbing her father's arm. But Jack stood rooted to the spot, staring out at the horizon. "It's too late," he whispered. "It's always been too late." Suddenly, the glow on the horizon intensified, and through the clouds Cora saw them, figures moving in the mist, half-formed, as if they were caught between worlds. The voices rose into a deafening cacophony, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. Jack's face was frozen in a mix of terror and awe. "Dad, we have to go!" Cora shouted over the wind. But before she could pull him away, the storm shifted. The clouds that had hovered over the ocean began to move inland, faster than any storm she had ever seen. The sky turned black, and the wind screamed with a force that threatened to tear them off the ground. Cora and Jack ran back inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The windows rattled, and the house groaned under the pressure of the storm. The whispers outside became clearer, more insistent, and Cora realized they were calling her name. Cora. It wasn't just her mother's voice anymore. There were others, voices of people she had known, people who had died in White Hollow over the years. They called to her, pleading, begging for something she couldn't understand. The storm battered the house for what felt like hours, but eventually it began to fade. Cora collapsed on the floor, exhausted, her ears ringing with the echoes of the voices. Jack sat beside her, staring at the door. "They'll come again," he said quietly, and they did. Night after night, the storm returned, circling, waiting, calling. Each time, the whispers grew louder, more desperate. Cora felt the weight of their sorrow, their longing for release. She knew the storm would not stop until it had what it wanted. On the seventh night, she stood at the window, watching the clouds roll in. Jack sat in his chair, silent, resigned. Cora knew what she had to do. She opened the door and stepped outside. The wind was fierce, but she stood her ground. The glow on the horizon returned, brighter than before, and the figures appeared once more, beckoning her. Cora walked toward the sea, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached the shore, the wind died down, and the world became eerily still. The voices were all around her now, a chorus of the forgotten. "I'm here," she whispered. The storm surged forward, and for a moment, Cora felt herself lifted off the ground, weightless, suspended in the eye of silence. The whispers grew louder, deafening until they were all she could hear. And then, everything went quiet. Cora stood alone on the shore. The storm was gone, the sea calm. The town behind her was untouched, but something had changed. She could feel it in the air, in the way the wind no longer whispered her name. She had given the storm what it wanted. But as she turned to leave, a single voice called out to her, faint, barely audible. It was her father's. The air felt different after that night, but Cora couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The storm had calmed, and the voices had stopped, but there was a silence now that was almost worse. The town carried on, unaware of what had transpired, oblivious to the strange calm that had settled over White Hollow. Jack, her father, hadn't spoken much since that night. He seemed distant, his eyes always drifting toward the sea, as though expecting something to return. But every day, the horizon stayed empty, the ocean unnaturally still. Cora, however, could still feel it, the pull, the weight of the storm that had never truly left. It haunted her dreams, whispering in the background of her waking moments. And even though the winds had stopped, she couldn't shake the sense that something had been left unfinished. One evening, after another day of restless silence, she found herself drawn back to the shore. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the water, but as she stood there, the light felt hollow, as if the world had grown thin. She walked along the beach, her feet sinking into the cool sand, her mind replaying the events of the previous nights. She had given the storm what it wanted. But what if it wasn't enough? As if in response to her thoughts, the wind picked up, just a soft breeze at first. Cora stopped, her heart racing. The air grew colder, and she could feel something shifting. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she knew, deep down, that the storm wasn't finished with her yet. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. But this time they didn't call her name. They called his. Jack. Cora's stomach dropped. She turned back toward the house, the distant figure of her father standing on the porch, staring out at the sea. His face was pale, his expression blank. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her in a chaotic symphony, urging her forward, but she hesitated. She knew what they wanted now. "Dad!" she shouted, her voice lost in the rising wind. She ran back toward the house, but as she reached the porch, Jack didn't move. He stood there, transfixed, his eyes locked on the horizon. "They're here," he said softly, barely audible over the wind. Cora grabbed his arm, trying to pull him inside, but he wouldn't budge. His skin was cold to the touch, his body rigid. The wind howled around them, and she saw it, out in the distance. The glow. It was the same light, the one she had seen in the storm. But this time it wasn't far off on the horizon. It was closer. Much closer. The figures were there, barely visible in the twilight, their shapes shifting in and out of the mist that clung to the waves. "They're coming for me," Jack said, his voice hollow. "No," Cora whispered, her grip tightening on his arm. "You're not going with them." But Jack's face was resigned. "It was always supposed to be me, Cora. I should have gone with your mother. She's been waiting for me." Cora shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "This isn't right. We stopped it. I stopped it." Jack turned to her then, his eyes filled with a sadness she had never seen before. "You can't stop the sea, Cora. You can't stop what it takes." The wind whipped around them, and the figures in the distance began to move, their shapes becoming more defined. Cora could make out their faces now, empty, hollow eyes staring back at her, mouths open in silent screams. They reached for Jack, beckoning him toward the water. Cora screamed, but her voice was lost in the wind. She pulled at her father's arm, but he was already moving, stepping off the porch and walking toward the beach. The glow intensified and the figures grew closer, their whispers filling the air, louder and louder until it was all she could hear. Jack walked toward the water, his movements slow but deliberate. Cora followed, tears streaming down her face, but she knew, deep down, that there was nothing she could do. The storm had never wanted her. It had always been waiting for him. As Jack reached the edge of the water, the figures surrounded him, their forms swirling in the mist. Cora watched, helpless, as they pulled him into the waves, their empty eyes never leaving hers. The glow faded and the wind died down, leaving only the sound of the crashing surf. Cora fell to her knees, her chest heaving with sobs. The sea was calm again, as if nothing had happened. The figures were gone, and so was Jack. For a long time, Cora sat there, staring out at the empty horizon, waiting for something, anything to come back. But the silence stretched on, and she knew, with a sinking feeling, that this time, the storm had taken everything. She returned to the house, the weight of the night heavy on her shoulders. The wind was gone, the whispers silenced. But as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, a soft sound caught her ear, a faint, almost imperceptible hum. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was coming from the window. Slowly, she walked over and pulled back the curtain. There on the horizon, far out to sea, was the glow. It was waiting.